Welcome, everyone. My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are delighted to have with us tonight Dr. Judy Chu, who's going to be talking to you about supporting boys' relationships and healthy developments. Welcome, Dr. Chu.
Thank you so much, Charlene. I'm so happy and excited to be here and grateful for the opportunity to share with everyone a way of looking at and thinking about boys that centers on their relational capabilities or what they're capable of knowing and doing in their relationships and highlights a shift that I observed in their relational presence that begins in early childhood and then also reveals how boys seek connections and resist disconnections throughout their development, through adolescence, and possibly through their whole lives. This view of boys and their development is based primarily on my exploratory studies which involved working closely with adolescent boys and then also 4 to 6 year old boys during early childhood. But I am also standing on the shoulders of giants as my work draws from and builds upon contributions from groundbreaking scholars like Carol Gilligan, life-changing educators like Mary Gordon, the founder of Roots of Empathy, and successful practitioners like Olga Silverstein. I have found this view to be very useful for understanding people and relationships in my personal life as well as in my professional work. And so I hope that you will find it helpful as well. Um, I thought I'd start out by talking a little bit about how I came to study boys and how I studied them and what I learned by studying them in this particular way, including, what impressed me, what concerned me, and what gave me hope. And then we'll have a discussion about how to support boys, not so much a list of things to do, but really just thinking about and talking about, what I heard from boys and what others have heard from boys about what they need from us as they're figuring out throughout their development, how it's possible for them as boys to be in relationship with other people and, participate in the world in ways that, feel true and kind of reflect their values and their beliefs and who they want to be. I began studying boys almost 30 years ago as a doctoral student at Harvard Graduate School of Education. It was there that I met my mentor, Carol Gilligan, and her research with her colleagues at the Harvard Project on Women's Psychology and Girls' Development revealed aspects of human development and psychology that had not been represented in traditional theories. So basically, what had happened was Carol and her colleagues noticed that much of psychological and developmental theory had been based mainly on studies of boys and men, particularly white cisgendered boys and men, and that girls and women were literally missing. They were just not in the participant pool. They were not in the samples, and so they wondered, what would happen if we included girls and women in these studies of psychology and human development? What would we learn? And the idea was kind of to create, to kind of create a complementary model of development. If we understand what's going on for boys and men, then we should also understand what's happening for girls and women. So it's very binary. It was very designed to kind of, you know, be complementary. But what happened was in listening to girls and women and really focusing on their perspectives to understand their experiences, that research that the Harvard Project did really revealed aspects of human development psychology that had not been represented, but were also relevant to other genders. So it was, the girls and women were talking about it, things that maybe boys and men were less inclined to talk about, things about relationships, things about care, things about emotion that, kind of societal assumptions and expectations kind of made more permissible for girls and women to share, but were also relevant and applicable to boys and men. And so what that happened was it really changed the conversation. It didn't just say, oh, here's something that's here's how it is for girls and women. It really raised new questions about boys and men. For instance, the Harvard Project found that, well, because the adolescent girls articulated these kinds of conflicts and struggles that they were experiencing in their relationships as they came up against heightened pressures during early adolescence to kind of conform to societal ideas about nice girl or the perfect girl, what they called the tyranny of the nice girl or the perfect girl. So as they developed kind of secondary sex characteristics, started looking like young ladies, because prior to that, they were allowed to be tomboys. They were allowed to kind of be more free about what they could do, what they could be interested in, what kind of qualities they could have, all these things. As they started to look like young women, they started to be expected to act like young women. And that kind of became a threat or a hindrance to their being able to be authentic in their relationships, to really know what they know, say what they feel, and just have a genuine feel they had a genuine voice and in their relationships. And so what by highlighting that, the girls were kind of like the canary in the coal mine that raised questions about whether, gender socialization towards norms of masculine behavior, conventions of masculinity might have similarly, limiting impacts or constraints on boys and men's options, despite there would be consequences and costs to their gender socialization, despite the social advantages that boys and men as a group might enjoy, certain privileges that come with being male and acting masculine. So it really, it changed the conversation to say, hey, there's also, in addition to our traditional models, which really associated maturity and manhood with a progression, almost a series of disconnections, a progression towards individuation and separation. What does it mean for our understanding of human development psychology to also consider that, relationships are actually central to our development, that the psyche is embedded in interpersonal relationships as well as our social and cultural contexts, and that, really learning, socialization, and development are inherently relational processes. So it's not that we go through life with the option of having relationships, but it's that oftentimes it's primarily through and within our relationships that, for instance, socialization message and pressures come to be personally meaningful and directly consequential. So let me see. Let me pause for a second because I get a little bit excited when I talk. But so this different, one of the books that Carol wrote about this work that she did with women and girls was called In a Different Voice, and she has since published this year another book called In a Human Voice, because what she wanted to really show was that she said if I had meant that this was a woman's voice, I would have called the book "Oh, in a Woman's Voice." But it is not a woman's voice. It's a different voice that is and the voice that it differs from is a voice that had been kind of based, based on what boys and men were comfortable saying, that had emphasized the series again, individuation and separation and themes of justice. And what was equally important in people of all genders' lives is this ethic not only of justice but of care, and this importance of relationships to everyone. And so um, it really by changing the conversation, it also kind of called into question our understanding of what it means to be normal, what it means to be healthy, what it means to be well adjusted. And rather than automatically assuming that individuals who struggle to fit our social constructions of gender or any other expectations that are really kind of imposed by society, this work really revealed how the societal expectations that we construct could also be troublesome, that maybe they weren't, you know, a natural fit for most people, that maybe not, the people who were struggling were pointing out a real problem with what was being asked of them, and what was being asked of them was maybe unreasonable or harmful to their health and well-being. So um when the question of what about boys, could this also, what's their experience of it, came up, the evidence from infant studies, research with babies as young as 2 and 3 months old, really showed that all humans are born with a fundamental capacity and primary desire to develop close, mutually responsive relationships with other people. So that is, as Daniel Stern's book, The Interpersonal World of the Infant, shows, people are born into relationships. We're born ready to connect. During infancy, this is essential to our survival. And throughout our lives, it is essential to being able to thrive. So throughout our lives, relationships are essential to our health and happiness. And yet, previous models of development meant, kind of were this progression away from relationships, that we're moving out of relationships. We become more independent. We do things on our own. And it's not to say that that's problematic. Obviously, you don't want people to have to hold your hand while you're walking, when you're a teenager. I mean, it's all these things we learn to do by ourselves. So it's not about not learning to be autonomous. It's about this kind of misconception that growing up and becoming mature means not needing people, because throughout our lives, we need our relationships to offer comfort, to offer companionship. And and studies now are showing that it's even tied to our physical health. And so, as you know from the Surgeon General's book, Together, loneliness is becoming, people describe it as an epidemic. There's a progression, there's a way that the developmental trajectory, that as it has been laid out to us, is problematic and not serving people well. So that it's worthwhile not to throw it away necessarily, but just to consider what the advantages are of getting on that path and what the costs are, so that we are aware and can make more informed decisions. So anyway, to come back to the infant research, it was showing that these kids, you can Google the still face experiment by Ed Tronick. You can also look at his book, The Power of Discord, with Roxanne Gold, and they really show that in as early as infancy, humans seek authenticity and reciprocity in our relationships. We know intuitively when these are lacking. So even as babies, we crave what's genuine, and we have excellent BS detectors. So when something, Tronic study with Catherine Weinberg actually particularly was looking at depressed mothers. And so the still face study was about asking the mother participants in the study to hold a straight face. And the babies immediately picked up on it, tried to re-engage, and when it wasn't working because the mothers had been told not to respond, and it was only a minute, but it's this torturous minute because you see the baby kind of eliciting, and when then they kind of become distressed and decide they need to self-regulate. They need to figure out what to do about this because what they were expecting, that authenticity and responsiveness, wasn't happening. Anyway, so I definitely recommend looking that up. It's on YouTube. In contrast to this, really rich relational capacity and desire at infancy, in contrast, older boys and adult men you find report having fewer emotionally close relationships and lower levels of intimacy within the relationships that they do have. And this discrepancy between infancy and adulthood suggests, again, that boys' socialization and development is associated with a move out of relationships. And that's something that's definitely kind of the default of boys' gender socialization is that, we prove that we are all grown up by being able to do it on our own. We don't need anybody else, and somehow asking for help or needing others, relying on our relationships is seen as a weakness. And so, people are discouraged. Everyone's discouraged from it. But if anyone's allowed to, it's people who are gendered feminine because relationships and emotions are gendered feminine and are more acceptable for girls and women or people who identify as female. So I want to point out that that progression is counterintuitive, that with age and experience, that boys would become less likely to establish and maintain their close relationships. You would think, it seems to make sense, I think, that as we become intellectually or cognitively more developed and as we have more experiences in relationship, that we get better at having relationships. So the question is, what's happening? Why would it go in the other direction? Why would it become more difficult for boys and men to develop the kinds of relationships that they need and that they want in their lives? um, just so happens, side note, as I was learning about this research on in girls and infants, I was encouraged actually and brought to study boys by boys themselves. I've told this story in other places, and so I'll just kind of recap it in a more succinct summary. But basically, a 13-year-old was asking what I was learning at Harvard, and I told him about these, the research that was being done with girls, and he basically said, "Yes, I understand. Everybody's interested in supporting girls. That's really important. That's a good thing. But there's stuff going on with us boys too, and nobody's talking to us." He goes, "You should study boys. You can start with me." And so that's how I was brought to study boys, was that a 13-year-old boy said, "You know what? There's things going on with us too. And the way that we're being talked about is not consistent with how we view ourselves, with how we experience ourselves to be. S- You should be interested in this." And I was. And so that's how that all started. So I conducted studies to explore boys' development in light of relational theories that emphasize the centrality of relationships in people's lives and experiences, and that recognize that again, the human psyche is embedded within relationships as well as social and cultural contexts, and using what also emerged from the girls' work, voice-centered relational methods that really centered on building comfortable, trusting relationships and focused on understanding the boys' experiences from their perspective, so in their words and on their terms. And so, and my studies involve, usually starting out with ethnographic observations, again, letting them get to know me, letting me get to know them, and kind of, and then scheduling later on in the second half of the year, semi-structured interviews to learn how they were experiencing their gender socialization, how they negotiate their identities and their behaviors and their styles of relating to and engaging with others in light of messages and pressures that manifest in their everyday interactions with peers and adults. So basically, what they're going through, what they're coming up against, what their relationships are like, what they're hearing, what they feel is being expected of them or elicited from them, and how they respond to that. I began by studying adolescent boys because it was an adolescent boy who invited me to start studying boys, and these were boys ages 12 to 18 in public and private schools on the East and West Coasts. And I was finding in listening to them that they were describing a gap again between how boys are said to be and how they experience themselves to be. But they were already starting to kind of tell me, like, but what's the point in challenging that? Kind of not that they were accepting it, but if they were accepting it, it was reluctantly. But they were saying maybe that gap is just the way things are. Maybe that's just how life is. People just aren't going to, with if you're lucky, maybe you have a best friend, or maybe you have somebody who, a parent or somebody who knows you very well, and you're lucky, but most people are not going to see you as you are, and that's just the way life is. And the more you are able to accept that, the more you demonstrate that you are mature and grown up. And when I talked to Carol, who was supervising my research about this, she said, you need to look earlier. You need to look at younger boys when they are still really actively struggling with this kind of imposition of how they're said to be, as opposed to what they know about themselves and how they experience themselves to be. And her theory or hypothesis was that what happens for girls at early adolescence, which is, the kind of given allowed to be more, they're more free to be, like, again, tomboys, free to be, to try a lot of different things until they start, getting initiated into womanhood. um that what happens for girls at early adolescence happens for boys during early childhood. Like, the messages about don't be a mama's boy, you can't be too close to your parents, don't be a sissy, all those messages, the boys don't cry, those come in earlier, those come in, to kind of caricaturize patriarchy. She goes, patriarchy goes after boys first, and so it goes after them in these younger years. And kind of you I've actually heard people tell boy babies that boys don't cry, which didn't make any sense to me, because that's how babies communicate their needs. But, like, so by 3 or 4 years old, this is starting to be an issue for them. They're starting to be, raise awareness. And so this is where, where my study came in, was just to really observe this moment of transition in their lives, where they, in early childhood, most kids are entering schools for the first time. And so, despite whatever they're learning at home and they're hearing from their families, and hopefully they're hearing supportive messages from their families, they're all of a sudden kind of having to navigate new relationships with peers, with adults that aren't necessarily in their families, and who may, and hearing kind of values and beliefs that may or may not be consistent with what they grew up hearing. And so, let's see. And three of the findings that came out of kind of studying boys in this way, the three that I wanted to address today, are that boys have relational capabilities, as was indicated in infancy, but these relational capabilities carry forth through early childhood into adolescence. But at early childhood, I did observe a shift in their relational presence that really reflected how they're reading and responding to their gender socialization, messages and pressures about what it means to be a man and what it means to fit in, be one of the boys and with the boys. And then third, their healthy resistance against impositions that threaten their connection. So this doesn't mean that they don't always, that they necessarily resist going along with what the boys were doing. Sometimes they wanted to go along with what the boys were doing, but when they felt like that really violated their autonomy, their ability to think and choose for themselves what they wanted to do, not just required compromise, but required what I call over compromise, like just really feeling like that's too much to give, it was too big of a sacrifice, then there was evidence of their healthy resistance. So to start with, I wanted to talk about, you know, boys' relational capabilities. And again, consistent with the infant studies, the boys in my study, both at early childhood and adolescence, really demonstrated that they were reading people and relationships with interest and accuracy, and that they were capable of being fully present and genuinely engaged. So this is in contrast to some stereotypes, particularly of adolescent boys, but sometimes of younger boys as well, that suggest that they are somehow incapable or uninterested in relationships. I found a lot of evidence, and other researchers as well. Niobe Way has several books on boys and their friendships and how they talk about their friendships. And there's a lot of evidence for boys' relational capabilities that's not just limited to my research. So boys, just to give an example, boys as young as 4 years old demonstrated the ability to be articulate, in the sense that they could express their views in a clear and coherent manner. They were direct in that they could come right out and say what they really meant. They were authentic in the sense that their behaviors reflect what they're thinking and feeling in that moment. And they're attentive in the sense that they were able to listen carefully and respond thoughtfully to others. Likewise, adolescent boys that I spoke with, and there were over 100 boys that I spoke with in just my work, but again, there's plenty of evidence of this in other people's work. They showed themselves to be self aware, emotionally perceptive, attuned to social cues. And so, I guess what I want to say is on some level, we know this. People with boys in our lives who have sons, who have boys that we work with in our classrooms, in our practices, we know that there is more to boys than stereotype suggests. Nevertheless, there is a tendency to overlook and underestimate boys' relational capabilities in the literature and in boys' everyday interactions. And I think there are at least two reasons for this. One of them is that we don't expect to see them. And as we're, our expectations are often informed or influenced by gender stereotypes, and confirmation bias leads us to pay more attention to and to give more credit to things that confirm our expectations. So we're more likely to notice, for example, when boys appear to be incapable and uninterested, and we'll say, oh, that's boys being boys or whatever, and to view that as normal. And we are more likely to view examples of boys being caring or sensitive or thoughtful or gentle as exceptions. I've had many parents tell me their sons are not like other boys because they're kind and they're sweet and they're wonderful. And I'm like, actually, not to make your son feel less special, but that's actually more common than you would think. And it just kind of goes to show what we come to assume and expect of boys, in part because we tend oftentimes we get kind of carried away talking about boys instead of talking to boys. But when we actually talk to them and listen to them, of course, we see that there's this whole range of things, some of them good, some of them more frustrating, but all of them very human and all of them very, very natural to being a whole person. Another reason that we may overlook or underestimate boys' relational capabilities is that actually they aren't always apparent. And so that brings me to my second observation, which was that there's a shift that begins in early childhood in their relational presence. And this shift, again, it's kind of when I entered the schools and they were 4 years old at the start of the year, they were kind of, out there, like they could and would tell you exactly what they were thinking and feeling. I describe it as kind of, well, that's not my description, but wearing their hearts on their sleeves, and at the same time, they were very quickly learning that there are consequences for how you behave, like how you present yourself will affect how people view you and treat you. And so they were learning very quickly to become selective and savvy and strategic about what they revealed about themselves and to whom. And so again, I'd say that I describe this shift as reflecting how they're reading and responding to their social contexts, and particularly messages and pressures associated with their gender socialization. Um, One of the dominant themes of that socialization being the need to prove masculinity, because it's not assumed. So you have to show that you are a real boy and therefore worthy and valuable. And so this was something where the boys were learning that, in these spaces where masculinity and femininity are defined as mutually exclusive opposites, boys learn to prove their masculinity by just, aligning with norms of masculine behavior, which have been described in books on cool pose, tough guys, masks of masculinity. And they learn to downplay and distance or differentiate themselves from anything and anyone that's deemed feminine. Right. So to show that they are not girls, not sissies, not mama's boys, they learn to hide or deny things that our society has gendered feminine, including their capacity and desire for relationships, their emotional lives, their rich emotional lives, their care and consideration, their tenderness and affection, their reliance on others. So in these spaces where, for instance, valuing relationships, it's something that's seen as what girls do. A boy's desire for close relationships or his ability to be very good at relationships becomes at odds with his masculinity and can be viewed as a weakness or a liability. Um, let's see. So I wanted to offer like an example from the study of the younger boys, the pre-K boys. and how they learn and how what this looks like, their gender socialization, because it can sound like this kind of abstract concept, and they actually offered a really concrete example. Um, they learned about their group and cultural norms of masculinity, including codes of conduct and the consequences of deviating from those, through their participation on the Mean Team, which was a club created by the boys, for the stated purpose of acting against the girls. So this was a microcosm of boyhood culture that manifested in their particular classroom. And it formalized a hierarchy among the boys and defined the boys officially in opposition to the girls. So, in terms of the hierarchy, for instance, Rob, who is 4 years old, tells me that Mike is the boss of the Mean Team. And he explains that Mike leads the whole gang. He decides everything. We don't get to say anything. Okay. And then also to give an example of how they define themselves in opposition to the girls, the boys actually originally named it the good team. But then they said, but wait, if the girls are the nice team, then we need to be the opposite of the girls. And so I guess we'll be the mean team. And so this is how it kind of plays out. And although it was expected that all of the boys would be on the mean team, just as all of the girls were on the nice team, membership on the mean team was not guaranteed. So in a private interview, Jake, 4-year-old Jake, tells me all of the girls in my class are my friends, but I act as though they aren't. Because if Mike, the boss of the mean team, finds out that I like the girls, he'll fire me from his club. That would be a real bummer because then I won't be on a team. And when later on Rob is accused of breaking one of the mean team's rules, he is told, "You're fired from the mean team. You're on the nice team. You're a girl." And so this possibility, this precarious masculinity and this incredible vulnerability to being kind of rejected and excluded, this possibility of being fired from the mean team and losing their status as boys meant that the boys had to be cautious about what they exposed and what they expressed and how they expressed it. And as they noticed who gets valued and what gets rewarded and punished in boys, they learned to display behaviors that were deemed appropriate and desirable for boys. So, again, very savvy, very strategic, very socially adaptive. So they, for instance, learn to anticipate how others might respond, partly by observing what happens to other kids when they do XYZ, or maybe by trial and error themselves. And they adjusted their behaviors to avoid negative consequences, being singled out, being picked on, being laughed at, whatever. They also learned to feign indifference, and what became very pervasive in their narratives and also carried through the adult. I saw it in the adolescent narratives as well, was saying, "I don't care." So just to kind of draw a parallel to the girls' research, as the girls entered, in early adolescence and kind of faced the pressures to conform to the tyranny of the nice girl, perfect girl, you heard in their narratives, "I don't know." And in the boys' narratives, the comparable phrase was, "I don't care." And it was usually around something that they very cared deeply about. Like, when one boy said to the other, "Then you're not my friend anymore." And the other says, "I don't care." They became very guarded, more self-conscious, and eager to kind of protect themselves from the things that hurt them most. So this shift in their relational presence, from presence to pretense, by way of masculine posturing, is what I was describing as that kind of second observation. Whereas boys had demonstrated a remarkable ability to be articulate, direct, authentic, and attentive, they began to appear, as they aligned with norms of masculine behavior, group and cultural norms of masculine behavior, they began to appear inarticulate, indirect, inauthentic, and inattentive. In other words, they started to look like stereotypical boys, or how boys are often said to be. And that's why the title of my book is When Boys Become Boys. The second boys usually was supposed to have quotes, but the publishers couldn't put them on there. So anyway, one of the boys' fathers actually noted how it was ironic that in trying to make a good impression, the boys began to cover up their innermost qualities because, as the father says, actually, that's what's most appealing about the boys. The adolescent boys in my studies similarly described how hierarchies, competition, and antagonism within their peer group culture made it necessary to shield parts of themselves that made them vulnerable to being ridiculed and rejected. And they needed to always be prepared to defend themselves. So one boy says, a ninth grader at a private boys' school on the East Coast says, "You're always being judged. You always have to keep up your guard and worry about what other people think. You don't want to show any vulnerability. It's such a competitive atmosphere that kids just attack if they think you're vulnerable." And another boy a ninth grader who attended a public school in California, said, if the other boys know the way you feel, they can throw you down anytime they want, like make fun of you if they want to, or whatever. And so in this kind of context that they perceived possibly accurately to be antagonistic, or to at least be possibly antagonistic, the boys learned to kind of fit in, not stand out, align with group and cultural norms, and that was considered very socially adaptive. And in fact, the shift, that began during early childhood in their relational presence could be regarded as part of normative development, what it means to grow up and become men. You can't just be spilling yourself all over, spilling your guts all over the place, telling people everything that you feel. You have to kind of get it together, get it under control, pull yourself together, and be very careful about how you present yourself. So that's part of, it's not surprising, and yet nevertheless, there's a sense of loss. Part of the possible consequences are you, as it turned out, the boys' main motivation, and this was from talking to the 4-year-old boys and talking to the adolescent boys and really focusing on their perspectives again to kind of figure out how they were making sense of this and how they were experiencing this. Their main motivation to conform to those masculine norms was not some sort of abstract desire to prove their masculinity. They were largely driven by this desire to identify and relate to other boys, right? So to be one of the boys, to be with the boys, to have relationships in which they could feel seen and valued by specific people as opposed to being approved of in general. This mask and what kind of was unfortunate was that the masculine posturing, or the prescription that society was telling them, for if you want to be popular, successful, etc., then you do these things, that those prescriptions were actually decreasing their chances of developing the emotionally close relationships that they wanted and need. So as they focused increasingly on maintaining appearances, they became less attentive and responsive, and could seem disengaged, disinterested, even defensive, right? And so the shift in their relational presence made it harder for the boys to engage with other people and for others to engage with them. This masculine posturing that was, supposedly for the sake of relationships, actually came at the expense of real relationships. And it becomes therefore possible for them to have relationships and yet still feel lonely. How are we on time, by the way? Because I get so into this, and I just want to, Charlene, if I could check in with you real quick.
I think you have 10 more minutes.
Okay, so let okay, let me let me talk about one thing. The next part, I just wanted, these are kind of add-on things, but I think they're kind of important. So I just wanted to point out again the precarious masculinity that because they could be fired from the mean team, because they could be called out at anyone by any time. Like, even the most, boys who otherwise seem to align very well, like they're star athletes, they're big, strong, they're whatever, they're successful, they're popular, but they wear a pink shirt to school or something, just it's always really arbitrary too. It has nothing to do with anything. It's kind of like whatever the rule of the day was, or whatever someone decided, oh, well, that's not masculine enough. They could be called out at any time. And one of the things that Joe Pleck in his book, The Myth of Masculinity, points out is that in addition to being precarious, this image of masculinity that boys are told to aspire to is actually ultimately unattainable. That nobody can be those things at all times. Nobody can be tough and stoic and self-sufficient. It's kind of an impossible list, right? And so what happens then, it kind of men and boys who believe in that, who buy into it, are then kind of destined to strive towards an image or standard of masculinity in relation to which they will inevitably fall short at some point, you know. And the ones who believe that it's very important for boys and men, not just themselves, but for boys and men in general, to adhere to be able to conform to and project that image of masculinity, studies show are more likely to experience, for instance, low self-esteem or anxiety, because they have an underlying sense of being unworthy or incomplete or inferior or never enough. So even if they're able to project that in some context, they know deep inside that they're not like that all the time. Again, because nobody is like that all the time. And they have anxiety when they worry that others will discover or judge their perceived shortcomings. So it kind of creates this really uncomfortable situation. And it's kind of like unnecessary suffering, because it's um, It's also been described in popular literature as this man box, and I'm not going to go into that activity today because of time. But when I do this in my class at Stanford, one of my students really astutely pointed out, they said, it's a trap because you are not safe when you're projecting that image, and you're not safe, definitely not safe when you're not. And so it's this trap that it's a lose-lose situation. And so that's a problem. Um, but the thing is, I also want to point out, and I think this is important too, is that it's not that masculinity or the qualities that we associate with masculinity are problematic in and of themselves. I know that there's a lot of discourse out there, the whole toxic masculinity, which I don't like that term, but it's not that, there's a lot of good terms that are, good things that are associated with masculinity: loyalty, responsibility, strength. It's not inherently problematic. So I want to point out that, and therefore, because it's not necessarily the content of that. Sorry, I get ahead of myself. That the solution cannot be simply to replace one image with another. To say, oh, well, we don't want the macho guy anymore. Now we want the sensitive guy. Because either way, it's really an externally defined, externally imposed set of expectations or ways to be. And there's, ways to fall short of both, because again, it's just they're not really realistic. They're not sustainable. They're not and but also what the problem actually is, the underlying problem is just that expectation that there is, just the idea that there is one right or only one right way to be. So problems arise when people feel compelled to distort themselves in order to conform to these externally defined and imposed notions of that will about what makes men worthy or desirable. So they feel compelled to act stronger than they are or tougher than they feel. And so it's really, I think it's important to not just say, oh, what we just need is a better image for boys to aspire to. I think it's, yes, we need to see more examples of all the different kinds of masculinity that are valid and valuable in our lives. And boys need to see that, that there are a lot of ways to be masculine. I love this one organization in Canada that says, my masculinity is mine to define. Because there are as many different masculinities or ways to be men and boys as there are boys and men. And so kind of moving away from this, again, this kind of singular, narrow idea that there's one right best way to be and everyone else is somehow unworthy or lesser than. So I think that was just one of the side notes that I wanted to get to. I'm starting to panic because I know I'm running out of time. Okay, so the one of the reasons I think this continues to be an issue, even though even in the last 2, 3 years, it's become evident that some of the social constructions of gender, not even necessarily specific constructions, but just the fact that there are social construction genders that were externally defined, externally imposed, that people feel pressure to aspire to or to kind of meet those expectations. I think one of the reasons that they continue is that although we know that they're problematic, we continue to kind of convey that we still value those things. For instance, in 2018, the Pew Research Center study found that as a society, although we say kindness and responsibility, strength, ambition, compassion, care, we think these are all great human qualities, we tend to value kindness and responsibility more consistently in women. We tend to value strength and ambition more consistently in men. And, about compassion and care, we feel ambivalent about it in men and positive about it when it's in women. And so, there are a lot of kind of confusing and conflicting messages. We view emotional men negatively, and yet we criticize men for not expressing their emotions. And so, again, until we're able to communicate clearly and consistently what we value in boys, and really, again, I hope that's not a specific list, but really in a way to encourage them to discover what feels right and true for themselves. And, as long as they're not hurting anybody else, that's the prescription. That is not a specific list of qualities, but a way to move through the world that allows them to discover what feels authentic and right for them. But until we can do that, I think their possibilities and options will continue to feel limited and limiting to them. Let me end on the good news, which is the third finding. Which is that the shift that I observed during early childhood in their relational presence is neither complete nor irreversible. There is evidence of boys' resistance, which is a healthy response to impositions that constrain their self expression, that undermine their integrity, and hinder their relationships. In the younger boys, it was, oh, and the older boys, it was when other people tried to tell them what to do or boss them around, because that kind of was violated their sense of autonomy. Or when other people tried to exclude them or end relationships with no explanation, they wanted to know what was going on. They didn't just say, oh yeah, well, whatever, I didn't really care anyway. They cared. And so they resisted. And this was especially empowered in individual kids when adults, sometimes their parents, sometimes teachers, sometimes a mentor or a friend, gave them language, permission, and guidance to trust and follow their instincts and to be respectful of differences. So they would literally tell them things like, if you don't like it, don't do it. And I would hear the kids saying, you may think that, but I don't. And it wasn't like a challenge to fight. It was just, you may think that, but I don't. And so it's just kind of teaching kids how to maintain their connections, especially in the face of conflict or disagreement, I think is a really valuable tool that we can all, use and benefit from. The other evidence of boys' healthy resistance is that although their relational capabilities, because of that shift, become less apparent, they are not lost. There is some literature that says, oh, well, this happens and then they lose it and then they're just, you know, helpless forever, and they're not lost. The inherent capacity and desire for relationships persists. There's evidence of it in adolescence, through adolescence into adulthood, throughout their lives. Boys and men continue to seek connections and resist disconnections. And the boys' healthy resistance shows that they are invested in preserving a version of themselves that feels honest and whole to them. So their integrity, and they are also wanting to think and make decisions for themselves. So their autonomy, and they want to be seen and valued as they are. So um, when we focus on boys' perspectives to understand their experiences, we find that they have relational capabilities that are a part of their humanity, essential to their health and happiness, and not feminine weaknesses, but human strengths. Therefore, acknowledging and supporting boys' relational capabilities is not asking boys to be something they're not. We are not turning them into girls, nor are we teaching them anything new, but we are actually enabling them to know what they know, feel what they feel, and develop abilities they already possess. These relational capabilities actually will serve them well in their professional as well as their personal lives, because good leaders, good colleagues, good people are good with other people. I mean, these are things that they will carry forward, and it will make them successful in the ways that matter most to their health and happiness. So this is, and Jackson Katz says, this is not sensitivity training. This is leadership training. This is, these are guidelines for how to live a good life and to be a happy person. Secondly, that boys' socialization can involve and result in disconnections when it forces a split between what boys know and what boys show. So as they conform to group and cultural norms, boys learn to project an image of masculinity that is familiar but misrepresents them. And as boys become adept at masculine posturing, it becomes easy to mistake culture for nature. So again, that kind of boys will be boys. Oh, they're not interested in relationships. They can't do relationships. They're out of touch with their emotions. That is not true to their nature. That is something they are learning to project, and part of an image they are learning to project. This means that what we often view as boy behavior is in fact an adaptation to cultures that emphasize hierarchy and competition, and require boys to prove their masculinity by acting tough, stoic, and self-sufficient. Okay, and then the third is that boys continue nevertheless to seek connections and resist disconnections. Conformity to socially constructed gender norms is not automatic nor inevitable. As active participants in their learning and development and socialization, boys can mitigate the effects and impact of their gender socialization by how they make meaning of the messages they hear and how they respond to the pressures to conform that they may experience. And so there are individual and as well as group differences in how they experience their socialization and what the outcomes are of that socialization. But they can't do it alone. They need allies to support their healthy resistance. And that's where we come in. Okay, I want to just pause right there. Because I know that this is supposed to be part of a conversation, and I want to welcome questions, and I know nobody needs to listen to me prattle on for even longer, but I want to open it up to Charlene and see where you'd like to go with that.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Judy Chu. I know and I remember now why I've spent my life in developmental psychology and education for young children. This was magnificent. And everybody, thank you for these beautiful questions. Let us see how far we can get. I will start by saying that I spent the first 10 years of my life as an educator at Stanford's laboratory preschool for the psych department. And if you had asked me in the 500 children that I had, what is the sweet and kindest sex? I would always say boys. So there's that. Okay, here we go. Thank you for all of your work and information. What can we as parents to adolescent boys do with this data and research to support our kids?
That's a great question. And I think one of the things, I mean, again, I don't have like necessarily like a playbook list, but I have like some general things that work that I've seen to work and that people have told me work. One of the things is to start with listening. Right? We listen to learn with genuine interest, with curiosity, with respect, with humility. We start from a place of not knowing and try not to assume. I make that mistake all the time. So I know it's not a perfect thing, but talking to boys versus about them. I found that boys can tell you what they need if they know you're actually listening, if you know you're really interested. Um, and asking questions, instead of offering, and again, this is where a huge weakness of mine. So sometimes it's something I aspire to, but asking questions rather than stepping in too soon to intervene and trying to fix things or offering unsolicited advice, because I always see it and I see someone hurting and I want to fix it for them, but oftentimes that's not what they want, what they need, and maybe my solution isn't even the right one for them. And so really just trying to be there for them and to listen to them and to let them experience how talking can help. Because if they gather, experiences that show that, oh, when they talk, nobody's listening and nobody's seeing them for who they are, then that will discourage them from trying it again. So really creating space for them to wrangle with their feelings and to talk about them and to see how talking it through can help them to figure it out for themselves, and only provide guidance when they ask. But even when they ask, again, we don't necessarily know better. And so it's kind of one of those, I have a quote from actually a seventh grade boy said to me, it's just the feeling that somebody knows what you're going through and relating. It kind of comforts. And so kind of bringing myself back to that reminder of we really just want, if you think about it for ourselves too, I mean, when we're having a difficult day or we're struggling with a problem and someone comes in and goes, oh, well, you just got to do this, or you just got to do that. That kind of diminishes the our problem, because they were like, if it was that easy, I would have fixed it already. Right. So just kind of remembering that they are experiencing, not the same things we're experiencing, but similar things in the sense that sometimes they just want someone to listen to them and to feel that, yeah, that sucked, or that's a bummer, or that's hard. And, what do you think you want to do about that? And maybe they don't want to do anything, but sometimes just getting out, or to go back to Mr. Rogers, when we talk about our feelings, it makes them more manageable, and being able to put it out there instead of holding it up and let it swirling around and kind of, whipping into more intensity, increasing intensity inside of them doesn't feel good. I've really, really seen, especially through Ashanti Branch's work with the Ever Forward
Yeah,
Club, how talking about things
yeah.
can be incredibly healing and helpful for people. And whether or not you have I'm not saying that we should all pretend to be therapists if we're not, but just there's actually a really lovely power to listening and being listened to.
And parents, if you've not seen Ashanti's work, Behind the Mask, check him out. It's really beautiful. And Judy, it makes me think we have Ellen Galinsky coming later this year, who wrote the seminal book, Mind in the Making, Parents. She has a brand new book called The Breakthrough Years. It's about adolescence. And she actually does just that. She said, we're always studying teenagers, we're studying adolescents. She decided to actually talk to them, see what they had to say. It's a very different perspective, right? They're like, we're smart. We know social media is a problem. We're figuring it out,
Right.
right?
And there's
Okay.
another reference too, it's called Honoring the Strategies of Disconnection by Irene Stiver at the Wellesley Center for Research on Women and the Stone Center, which was to say that the goal is not necessarily to change boys' behaviors unless they're hurting someone, themselves or others, because there's often a reason why. What they're doing is serving a purpose, and they're doing what works, and their behavior is unlikely to change until an equally viable and effective alternative becomes available. So, it's like whatever you can't just kind of take away all of their defenses and take away what they're doing without offering something that feels practical and relevant and is effective for them. And so again, that's the my kind of caution or reminder against trying to go in and fix it or telling them just to stop doing what they're doing. If that's a placeholder, if it's serving a purpose, then we need to give them something to deal with whatever purpose is being served by that particular behavior that
Okay.
that we're hoping to replace with something that might be.
So, Dr. Chu, we have several questions around a concept that you talked about, and that is, as our sons try to conform to that trap of masculinity, they're also suffering. Can you say more about how we can help our sons navigate between that rock and a hard place so that they don't end up isolated and insecure?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question, and it's such a huge question. Um, I think one of the things that the research shows, including my own, is kind of when things that we can focus on is fostering their sense of connection to themselves and to others. So, by sense of connection to self, that's really about kind of their sense of integrity, autonomy, being in touch with themselves, because it's very easy to kind of become kind of going on autopilot, saying they don't care, shutting off, and just kind of saying, these feelings that I'm feeling, I don't have space for them. I can't deal with it. It's too frustrating. And so I'm just going to compartmentalize and not deal with it. And and that can be temporarily helpful, but in the end, it really cuts them off from the things that will help them get through it, right? And so, by fostering connection to self, it's really, kind of encouraging their self awareness, their self acceptance, and their trust, helping them to be mindful and grounded, to realize, even if they don't necessarily express a full range, because they still need to be in the world. They can't always, none of us can have our way, what we want all the time. So living life is full of compromises, but to prevent the over compromise, we stay aware of our compromises. We stay aware of what we're giving up. We know what we want, even if we're not getting what we want or asking for what we want. We at least know for ourselves. And so, Arno Grant Gruen talks about having access to your own feelings and needs. I think at the heart of it, and this is indicated by the quality of your presence, which depends in part on relationships. So that's where the parents can help, is to really foster that sense of presence of their connection to themselves so that they can feel grounded and secure in their own, in what they know about themselves, and then also fostering their connections to others, because depends on relationships and relationships depend on presence. So with others, it's a sense of belonging, and by belonging, that's different from fitting in, which is you can be like me. Belonging is you can be who you are, and then kind of also reminding them of interdependence and being in it together, so they're not struggling alone. Because this stuff, one of the things that I found in my interviews with adolescent boys at the end is that they always wanted to know, am I the only one who's struggling with this? Is it
Yeah.
just a problem with me? And one of the things I like about that film, The Mask You Live In, is in 90 minutes, all the people who watch it instantly know that they are not alone, that this is something that everyone is feeling and frustrated with. And so that sense could kind of break through the pluralistic ignorance of like, oh, like, which is emperor's new clothes, right? To say like, oh, I'm not the only one who's seeing this, gives them a sense of we in the world and we can get through it. And that I found in my research with the adolescent boys, that the boys who talked about that collective sense of we, that sense of being joined either by a specific person like their best friend or their mentor, and actually the Resnick et al. Adolescent Health Study talked about that. The single best protector against social risk and psychological risk is having access to one close confiding relationship. That sense of being joined has incredible power in protecting kids as they kind of navigate through. It doesn't mean that they won't have challenges in their lives. It doesn't mean that they won't have these, bad experiences, but it means that they can face it with their integrity intact and with access to support to get through it. And so really helping them to develop, that social awareness and consideration and trust, all the things that will help them to be good friends, helping them to, that will enable them to have relationships in which they can share themselves with others, where there's mutual understanding and support, where they can actually express as well as realize the full range of thoughts and feelings and desires. These are all kinds of things that will improve their quality of relationships, which will help them, again, just to have someone else be like, yeah, this is hard and that's ridiculous and they're asking too much of me and I can't give that right now, and to be like, yeah, I get it. Yeah, I see it too. So joining the resistance or allowing them to feel joined in their healthy resistance when those impositions inevitably arise and the challenges in life inevitably present themselves.
Oh, thank you, Judy, for that. Wonderful comments in the chat. Thank you, everybody. Yes, amazing discussion, so many insights. Here's kind of the bottom line question, Judy, I think for what parents are worried about. How do we, as parents of a teenage boy, move them to express and be authentic in their seemingly bro culture group?
I think it's about I think one way to kind of deal with it is not to say that they should show everything to everyone in every place. It's so to kind of again kind of really acknowledge the wisdom that the boys when they become more selective. They realize that, this not everyone is going to it's not always safe, and I would never ask anyone to encourage kids to put themselves vulnerably out there when it's not safe. I mean, because safety, I think, is incredibly important, and we don't want them to have bad experiences if we can prevent them. I mean, it doesn't mean they won't ever have bad experiences, but we don't want to put them in harm's way. But I think that, one of the things is just really helping them to, again, trust their instincts and to kind of carve out. So maybe they're not going to speak up, in the middle of a bro fest, or whatever, where other people where they're likely to get made fun of. Maybe they can find, a friend that they can pull aside and have a private conversation with, or to have space, and this will come also with age, right? I think the good one thing to reassure them is that it won't always be as hard as middle school and early high
Yeah,
school. It
yeah,
won't always be that harsh. And when everybody starts to feel more comfortable in their bodies and more confident in their identities, they will stop picking on everybody else in a desperate attempt to say, look at him instead of me, because I'm feeling really insecure right now. And so as they get to about, 17, 18, 19, as they enter, young adulthood, they will start to feel like, oh, there is a space for me, there's a place for me. And if we can get that kind of feeling and message to younger boys, to tell them this is what you can look forward to. It won't always feel like this. It won't always feel so confusing or so scary or so, you know, awful, that we are heading in a better direction. And also just confirming their worth. I think. I mean, I always end up, citing Mr. Rogers a lot, because it's really about kind of confirming their worth and their masculinities, and 'cause everyone seeks validation, and clarifying the source of their worth, which is, who they are versus what they do. So, as Mr. Rogers always says, I like you just the way you are.
yeah.
You made this day special just by your being you. And it may seem counterintuitive to some, because people will oftentimes, again, dismiss boys as a group because they're like, well, they're the dominant group. They have power, they have status. That's as a group, that's in an abstract sense. Individual boys and men often don't feel powerful, often don't feel secure about their status. Again, they're human. These are human things to feel, especially when we're going through adolescent transitions, relationship changes. Everything in our lives that feels uncertain and unpredictable makes us vulnerable, and that applies to people of all genders. And so just to remember that they are not robots, and that they are human, and they need to be cared about and cared for, and that is not a weakness. That is just a part of life. We need people. No one, I tell my students on the first day of class, no one succeeds alone. And so, we want to try to remember who are the people who cared about you and loved you into being, and draw strength from that. And remember that throughout our lives, we need people like that, because life is hard. Who wants to do, no one wants to do this alone. And so the more that we can be there for each other, the better off we'll all be.
Oh, true. Dr. Chu, we've reached the end of our hour. Are you willing to answer one more question?
Of course.
I just thought this was really sweet and important, and I think it's a good one to end with. This is a dad. He says, how can fathers help their sons maintain their masculinity along with being kind, thoughtful, and responsible? And why are those traits sometimes considered mutually exclusive?
I think that's a great question. And there's actually, on the hopeful note, there's a huge movement now to say that masculinity, there are kind, thoughtful masculinities there, because there are kind, thoughtful men. And so that's one of the ways to kind of do that, is just to model. I mean, one of my things that I didn't get to is you model your values. Then all of a sudden boys see, yeah, it's possible. So as they're looking for how, trying to figure out how it's possible for them as boys and eventually as men to be in the world, the more examples they see, especially in their everyday lives, of men doing exactly all of these things, of being thoughtful, of being caring, of being kind, then it becomes a possibility, right? It doesn't become something that, oh, only women do, or only girls do, or only people who are gendered feminine do. This becomes something that, of course, this is a part of men's repertoire, and this is something that men can be very, very good at. And so I think that's one of the ways, is just to model your values. And that's not to put pressure on parents to be perfect all the time, because actually kids love it when we show them that we're struggling and we make mistakes. And that, again, it makes it okay for them to not be perfect and to not have everything figured out and under control. So the more that I know it seems counterintuitive because you feel like, oh, we need to create a sense of security for our kids by, always having the answers and always, that actually doesn't create security for them. What makes them feel secure and good about themselves is knowing that they can mess up and still be worthy and still be lovable and still be valuable human beings. And so that's one of the ways to model it. And if you wanted, there's actually a really nice chapter in my book about from that the parents talking about this, and some of these boys' fathers were just magnificent in how they modeled kind, thoughtful, sensitive masculinities with their sons and for their sons, and learned from their sons, and kind of got back in touch with those things. You don't have to buy the book, you can get it at a library or whatever, but I found that what the parents shared to really, it helped me guide my actions when I was raising my son, who is now 21.
So Dr. Judy Chu, that was magnificent. You can tell by all the wonderful comments in chat and all the emojis. Don't you love those floating hearts? Thank you, everybody, for your wonderful questions. We know we could do this for another hour, but look at that. It has been a wonderful discussion, Dr. Chu, and we thank you for this. It'll be a wonderful video. And we appreciate all of you. We appreciate all those great, vulnerable, caring questions as we support our boys. I have one and a grandson on the way. So, wow, look at that, Judy. Isn't that beautiful?
Thank you so, so much to everyone for your time. I haven't been looking at chat because I can't multitask, but I'll look. And also, I know that I actually wanted to cover 10 weeks of stuff in this 30 minutes. And so I know that I didn't hit everything as clearly and comprehensively as I'd like. So I'd welcome you to, I'm on LinkedIn. You can reach out. I'm happy to answer questions if you didn't get a chance to have your question answered. I can also offer my email address. But LinkedIn or email, you can contact me, and I'm happy to clarify, explain, or answer anything that I didn't get to. But thank you so much to everyone for your time.
That is very generous. Thank you, everybody. We hope to see you again soon. Really appreciate all the great questions and the comments. Take care. And special thanks to you, Dr. Judy Chu. Good night, everybody. Take 1 minute and fill in the survey that's going to pop up. Bye.